Hey film fans, 1975 was a fantastic year for Hollywood cinema. You had Shampoo, Dog Day Afternoon, Arthur Penn's Night Moves, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. There were great kids movies like one of my favorites as a kid, Escape to Witch Mountain. Cult movies, The Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was a fantastic year, but there was one film, that every film fan, every film journalist, other filmmakers were all waiting for. It was the film that was going to cement this growing change, this growing movement in Hollywood cinema, this adult-orientated, director-driven, cynical, but well-constructed cinema that was just a few years away from being called the new Hollywood. And if this film landed and did as well as everyone expected, the era was there to stay. That film was Nashville, directed by Robert Altman. And it's a fantastic film, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It came out in June of 1975, and everybody was very excited, and 10 days later, a great white shark ripped its face off and ate it, and Hollywood movies were never the same. Let's consider the Blockbuster as we continue with the series, The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood. Hey everybody, Jaws did change the way that Hollywood thought about movies. Summer movies, movie distribution, sales, all kinds of things. And it was, let's not say unexpected, but it was surprising that it did it so forcefully. And in a couple of years later, Star Wars would kind of come and double down on those changes that Jaws presented to Hollywood. But it didn't actually come out of nowhere. A lot of the changes that I've talked about in this series led, perhaps not directly, but to the path of convergence that would make the Blockbuster inevitable. Changes in distribution, changes in technology, changes in the studio system structure, all kinds of things happened. So, as with a lot of the videos in this series, let's start with a little history. When it comes to the Blockbuster, it's best to think about it not just as a type of film, but as a system generating money around film. And like everything in Hollywood, it comes down to three things: production, distribution, and exhibition. And I'm going to start at the end and work my way back to the beginning. So let's consider how exhibition changed from the classical era to 1975. In my video in this series on industry roots, I talked a little bit about something called vertical integration. I'm not going to go into it in detail here. You can watch that video, and there's a lot of great resources online. Just even the Wikipedia page will tell you what vertical integration is. The gist is that during the classical era, the studio system era of Hollywood, the major studios owned the means of production, making the films, distribution, which is getting the films to the cinemas, but also involves marketing and public relations and things like that, and exhibition, showing the films. So in short, Paramount would make a movie, then it would rent its movie to a Paramount cinema where they would show the movie. So all that money, even though it's going to different subsidiary companies, is funneling up to Paramount. Vertical integration. In 1948, the Paramount Decree, which is in that same video on industry roots, divorced exhibition from the system by saying it was monopolistic or restraint of trade for the studios to own the theaters. And that was kind of one of the beginnings of the end of the classical system, as I talk about. But things didn't just change overnight. They didn't start exhibiting films completely differently in 1949. A lot of the patterns remained very similar, and it took, like it often does, it took a long time for the change to come. And so I want to kind of talk about two things that had to do with exhibition back in those days that persisted throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. And one is called Roadshow exhibition. Now, this term can be a little bit confusing because there are actually two meanings of roadshow, and they're different, but they overlap, and they both feed into the rise of the Blockbuster in different ways. And one is about roadshow exhibition, and one is about roadshow films. And I'm going to talk about both, but first we're going to start with roadshow exhibition. And it's very simple. I've referred to it elsewhere. It's just the idea that films in the 40s, 50s, and so on generally were not released wide. They were released in New York and Los Angeles, overseas in London, Paris, whatever. And then they would play in those cities for an extended period of time. How long? Depended on the film, it depended on the studio, it depended on the era, it depended on the popularity of the film, and so on. A lot of factors went into this, and it wasn't a strict, fixed system, but that's basically how it worked. And they did this for a few different reasons. First of all, it was kind of a way to test the film. Is this going to be popular? Now, of course, studios knew then, just like they know now, that audiences in New York and Los Angeles are different, but audiences in New York and Los Angeles are different from audiences in Boston or Chicago or Peoria. But they also knew from experience that if it did well in New York and Los Angeles, it's probably going to do well in Boston and San Francisco. If it does well in Boston and San Francisco, it's probably going to do well in Seattle and Philadelphia. If it does well there, it's going to go to Baltimore and Chicago and Houston and then to smaller towns and so on. And so it was a way to test the audience reception of these films. It was also incentivized financially because they didn't have to print as many copies of the film. Printing and processing a film is expensive. If you're going to show in 2 cinemas in New York and 2 cinemas in Los Angeles, that's 4 prints. Expand it to 10, expand it to 20, and then those prints move around the country. When it's done in New York, that print goes to Boston. That's the Roadshow, right? When it's done in Boston, that print goes to Baltimore or Philadelphia or wherever it might be. And the other important aspect of it was it allowed a film to grow word of mouth popularity, or buzz, as we would later call this in the kind of 80s and 90s. So film critics in those cities, in the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times, would discuss it. Maybe it would get talked about on the radio. Maybe you would have local newspapers pick up the New York Times review of the film and run it in their newspaper. And so people started to talk about the films before they got to their cities, and this would create anticipation. So all of these were the reasons for this roadshow exhibition model, and this was continuing up into the 1970s. What that meant, though, for box office was that box office came in slowly. So in these times, of course, box office was always a marker of a film's success. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But the things we seem to care about these days, opening weekend box office, 10-day box office, second weekend, third weekend box office. Those things were not really factors because, yes, it was great if your film opened big in New York and Los Angeles, but what you wanted was a film with legs. What you wanted was a film that would open in New York in May and still be playing in Peoria in November. So you're getting a slow accumulation of box office. And over time, the final number was important, but it wasn't that, ooh, it made 100 million this weekend, I think we're okay. The second thing that has to do with exhibition, and this is fairly complicated, another one to maybe go look up, but it is worth talking about a little bit because it has to do with the way studios controlled where films could play. And that's something called the run zone clearance system. And again, I talked about it in the Industry Roots video. You can go watch more about it there. But that basically meant when they still owned the cinemas and soon after, and they controlled where a film would play, it went something like this. A Paramount film would open in a Paramount cinema in New York City. In Los Angeles, it was a little different because of the sort of widespread nature of the city. Sometimes a film might open in 2 or 3 different cinemas around Los Angeles. Paramount Cinemas in this case. And that was called The Run. And it would run in that zone until the studio deemed, we've made as much money here as we can. That might be a week, that might be 6 weeks. If people stop coming after the first week, let's move on. If people are still coming, if the cinemas are full every night, keep it going, keep it going. So the zone was the place where it would play. New York City, North New Jersey, South Jersey. It couldn't be playing in New Jersey while it was in New York. So if you were in Jersey and you wanted to see it, you either had to travel into Manhattan or you had to wait. If you were in Boston and you wanted to see it, you had to take that drive to Manhattan, unlikely, or you had to wait. And then when the studio deemed that it was finished, that it was completed, that they'd made as much as they could, it would clear the zone and move to another zone. That's the run zone clearance system. And if you're familiar with the term second run, like a second run film, it actually comes from that, because the idea was that if a film continued to do really good, a studio would bring it back to one of its initial zones in the hope that now the word of mouth had grown so extensive and so positive that the people in that first zone who hadn't seen it would have changed their minds. It would go back to a zone for its second run. And we still use this term today for their second run cinemas, where you go and you pay $2. Well, it's probably $5 now. I don't know what it is. So that's how films were exhibited and distributed in the classical era. In terms of distribution, there are 2 things worth thinking about. One is publicity for films. Most publicity was done at the cinema. There was also radio publicity. Most advertising for new films would be in the cinema. And if you were ever wondering, what they used to do when they had a coming attraction, they would ship or distribute the film reels to the cinema, and tacked on at the end of the film reel would be a short advertisement for an upcoming feature. And initially in the 20s and in the 30s, they would show that advertisement for the film after the film ended. So you'd have the film and the same film reel, the 3rd reel or the 5th reel, however long the film was, would run into that advertisement. So it came after the feature. It trailed the feature. Studios soon figured out that even though old movies don't have long end credits, the credits were all front loaded up until about the 70s, and it would say the end, and that would be the end. But even with that short, the end, audiences tended to get up and leave and not stay for those trailing bits of advertisement. So they started attaching them to the front. And there was a whole era of cinema in the 30s. It has to do with the Depression and so on, when going to the cinema was an experience, and it was generally a double feature with cartoons and newsreels and trailers. And they continued to call them trailers even when they moved them to the front of the main feature. And this is where the word trailer comes from, if you've ever wondered, that it used to be after the film at the end of the film reel. Otherwise, you had to find out about the films from film magazines, newspaper articles, and so on. Remember, there was no TV up until the 50s, and the film industry had a ambiguous or ambivalent relationship with television at first because it was a major competitor. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. The other element of distribution that was rife in the classical era that doesn't really factor too much into the Blockbuster, but might be coming back, is something that was called block booking. And I just wanted to mention it briefly. And this was the studio practice of saying, do you want this big film? Do you want Casablanca? Well, you have to take this other Warner Brothers films that's not as big. You can't have Casablanca unless you take the second film. That's block booking. So you want to book this film, cinema, you need to take both, or 3, or whatever it might be. Recently, a federal judge in New York ruled that the Paramount decrees no longer hold, actually, and we might see the return of block booking sometime soon. So this is how films were distributed and exhibited. Let's talk a little bit about production. So as I've talked about before, films were made by the studios, and the studios oversaw every aspect of it. They chose the directors, they chose the production designers, they chose the cast, they owned the studio sets, they owned the costumes, they owned the cameras, and the studio heads like Louis B. Mayer or Jack Warner, whoever it might be, or their subsidiary people would put these films together. And I've mentioned before, this was called the producer unit system. And linked to that was the idea that different studios made different kinds of films. So in the 30s and into the 40s, Warner Brothers made social movies, they made crime movies, they made war movies. MGM made big, extravagant movies, they made musical movies, and so on. And they churned out a certain amount of this genre fare, and every once in a while, they would make a big film, an important film, a long film. And this is where the second use of this term roadshow comes in. Because a roadshow, in this sense, was a film that was treated almost like a theater experience. And they were almost only shown in the big, fancy theaters with curtains, you know. And a lot of small towns had these. You might see, if you're walking around Decatur, Illinois, or Bangor, Maine, that there are these old opera houses that acted as cinemas. And they weren't as extravagant maybe as the movie palaces of New York or Los Angeles, but they were theatrical experiences. And these roadshow films would often open with an overture. They would have an intermission. And you were expected to go and sit there and watch them for kind of 3 hours. And they were roadshow in the sense that they followed the roadshow exhibition model. So they only played in certain cities for a certain amount of time, just like all other films, but that they were a bigger deal. They were a night out. They were an event, right? This might sound familiar. And so you had to go and see them. And these roadshow films are, in a way, proto-blockbusters. They were the must-see film of the summer. They were the film that everybody was talking about, that everyone had to see. And even though their distribution and exhibition model was different, they had that veneer of something important, something special. So all of these things were the way that films were made, distributed, exhibited, really up through the end of the 60s. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a roadshow. And if you get the Blu-ray of 2001 now, it opens with an intermission. I remember watching it with some friends one night, and we had partaken of our green ally, and we sat there in the dark listening to this music, wondering like, when's the movie gonna start, man? Because we didn't realize we were watching the roadshow version with the overture over a black screen. But we figured it out. So these kinds of films were still happening, and kind of proto-New Hollywood films like 2001 could also be this classical era roadshow type film. But that began to change quickly. Now, all of these practices that I've just described were practices of the studio system, mainly the big 8 studios, but other companies were making films. Poverty Row studios like Republic Films, independent filmmakers, and so on. And they didn't always have the same access to that distribution network, so they had to take a different approach. And sometimes the studios even followed some of these different approaches. So there are a couple of different release patterns that are worth knowing about. The first one, which will sound very obvious, is saturation booking. And saturation booking was the idea that instead of following the roadshow model or the run zone clearance system, a studio large or small, or an independent filmmaker, would put the film in several cinemas at the same time, in the same zone. So maybe in 4 or 5 or 6 cinemas in and around New York City or in and around Los Angeles. Back then, they did this for a couple of reasons. Mainly because they didn't think the film was going to do that well. They might have a film with a star in it, so it had some drawing power, but it was a film that nobody in the studio, big or small, thought was going to do well. So they would want to get as much money out of it as they could before bad, negative word of mouth got out. So they would saturate a zone with it so that more people could go see it. So it's kind of the opposite of trying to build popular word of mouth. They're trying to forestall negative word of mouth. But that was seen as a kind of a desperate measure, especially by the studios. But it worked. So you could get, they did know as far back as the 40s that you could get a lot of people in the same zone to go see a film in different cinemas if that was the strategy you wanted to take. Another process, which really wasn't around that much during the classical era, but near the end of it in the 60s and into the 70s, is something called four-walling. And this was generally used at first by independent filmmakers, but the studios played around with it in the late 60s and early 70s. And four-walling is the idea that you take your film to a cinema and you rent that cinema out for a certain amount of time so that your film is the only film that plays there. And back in the days before multiplexes, when there were one-screen cinemas, you would dominate that cinema. So if people wanted to go to the movies, they had to go to your movie. A famous example of a successful four-walling distribution strategy was Tom Laughlin's film Billy Jack from 1973. And he had tried to distribute that through a couple different studios, didn't work, took it on his own and four-walled it across America and made tons of money. And the studios kind of looked at that and like, that's interesting. Four-walling and saturation booking are not the same thing, although they overlap. The idea is to flood a market with a film so that people who want to go to the movies only have the option of seeing that film. Saturation booking is about being in several cinemas at once. Four-walling is about being in one cinema, but being the only film there for an extended period. And the way four-walling worked was that the filmmaker would come to the cinema and say, hey, I want to play my film and only my film for this weekend, or for this week, or for these 2 weeks. And the cinema would agree to this, and the way it would work is that generally, there were variations, the filmmaker would take all of the box office and the cinema would take all the concessions money. Remember I said earlier that film and film studios were wary of television in the 50s and into the 60s because it was a competitor. But some companies had started to understand that you could use the two media together to kind of cross-market or for complementary purposes. Lou Wasserman, who came up in one of the earlier videos from MCA Universal, was an early proponent of using television to market films. There you have people sitting there watching. They obviously enjoy screen drama or screen comedy. Get them thinking about your film. And so while in the 20s to the 60s, trailers, or previews, if you call them that, were generally only shown in the cinema, by the late 60s and really into the 70s, they started to appear on television. And what does this have to do with blockbusters? Well, as I've mentioned elsewhere, by the late 60s, Hollywood was in the financial dumps, right? There was a recession in the country, but the Hollywood recession was particularly deep and lasted longer. So one of the reasons New Hollywood rose, as I've talked about in other videos, is that Dennis Hopper and Arthur Penn and Francis Ford Coppola and so on made cheap films that made a lot of money. And this was good for the bottom line. So these studio heads like Charles Bluhdorn and these producers like Robert Evans were like, yeah, make your little movie. Let's see if it works. And when it worked, they made a ton of money. And New Hollywood kind of brought Hollywood itself out of the financial dumps. As I said in the other films video, it wasn't only New Hollywood, it was the disaster films, it was Disney films and so on. But it started to rise out of the dumps. But while they were still in those financial dumps, studio heads were looking around at other ways to make money. And they started looking at saturation booking. Look at what these bad movies are doing, or these B movies, or these Poverty Row, or these independent movies. They're putting their films in a lot of cinemas at once and making a lot of money. What if we did that with good films? What if we eschewed the Roadshow model and did our own kind of saturation booking? And they learned from four-walling too, because they learned that if your film is the only film in an area, then that's the film that people have to go see. If your film is the only film in this cinema and that cinema and that cinema, then that's the film that people have to go see, right? So they started thinking about this, and in the early 70s, you start getting wider release strategies. A pioneer in this was Robert Evans at Paramount, who looked at saturation booking and thought, we can do this with good films as well. And there were two proto-blockbusters that Evans produced that are really worth thinking about. The first is Love Story from 1970, and the second is The Godfather from 1971. These two films, even though they don't seem to have a lot of common on the surface, had a lot in common in terms of their production and distribution. First of all, they were both based on what at the time were unpublished manuscripts. So the books were due to be published, but they hadn't come out yet, and Paramount got a hold of them and said, let's make movies out of these. I'll come back to that in a minute. Second, they both had high-profile stars, and they were distributed in very similar ways. So they were two high-profile Paramount films that were released in hundreds of cinemas nationwide all at once. This was not something that was done, but it was dramatically, emphatically successful. Love Story cost $2.5 million to make and made nearly $50 million in a few months and made nearly $100 million before its first run ended. The Godfather cost a little more, around $6 million, but made nearly $100 million in its first few months of distribution and well over $100 million in its entire first run. And a lot of that was down to this saturation booking, or what we now call wide release. The Godfather was also one of the first mainstream films to use television trailers. So they're like, we are going to saturate the market, not just with the films, but with publicity for the films before they come out, creating anticipation. And so the marketing of the films and the distribution and exhibition of the films started to change dramatically with those two movies. And other studios started to follow suit, including Warner Brothers, who took a similar strategy with The Exorcist in 1973. Now we're almost up to Jaws, but before we get there, I want to talk about those manuscripts for a little bit, because if you remember on my second industry video from a few weeks ago, one of the things that was happening to Hollywood studios around this time was that they were being purchased by large conglomerates, in some cases multinational conglomerates. So you had Paramount owned by Gulf Western, you had United Artists owned by Transamerica, you had Warner Brothers owned by Kinney International, and so on. And these large companies often owned other companies. So for example, Paramount owned book publishers. Paramount owned sports teams and sports arenas, Madison Square Garden for a little while. And so one of the things that they started to realize is that we can use our other properties to sell the film. And we can use the books to sell the film. So Love Story was written as a manuscript, bought by Paramount. The book was finished and published on Valentine's Day of 1970, love story, sold and made millions, but created anticipation for the film that was released in December of 1970. So you had this sort of 10-month buildup of people reading this weepy love story and prepared to watch these two beautiful people, Ryan O'Neal and Ali MacGraw. Love means never having to say you're sorry. And it worked fantastically. And The Godfather did the same thing, and Jaws did the same thing. With Jaws, the marketing campaign was even similar. So here is what the book looks like, and here's the poster for the film. So you can see they're using similar imagery as well to sell these. And when this started working in the early 70s, studios started to ask themselves, what else can we distribute? Where else can we make money? We can sell things with the film on it. T-shirts, lunchboxes, beach towels, commemorative items, books about the making of, and so on. And they would either distribute those things through their own subsidiary companies, or they would construct deals with other companies that were beneficial for both. So you get this today in the McDonald's Happy Meal. The company enters into an arrangement with McDonald's where they make so much money from the Happy Meal, which has whatever movie is on it, and McDonald's makes more money because people want the movie The Simpsons Happy Meal or whatever it is. So it's a situation where the companies use each other and both benefit. This is described by a term which is a really lovely word if you think about it, but has this sort of American business speak ring to it that can make it a little uncomfortable. Synergy, right? Synergy is the idea that two or more parties come into an arrangement from which both benefit. And when studios started to realize the lucrative potential of synergy, they started to think about films differently. So what does Jaws have to do with all of this, besides having made a lot of money? In some ways, Jaws' status as the first blockbuster is the result of a bunch of happy accidents. This was the first major Hollywood film to be shot on the ocean, and there are a lot of stories out there about the troubled production. How are they going to get a realistic looking shark? Are they going to train a great white shark? They thought of that for a little while. Good luck. They've got mechanical sharks. They've got different types of model sharks. They don't quite look realistic. And this led to some decision making about the presentation of the shark in the film, which I've talked about elsewhere, and Verna Field's role in that as the editor. But it also led to a fantastically ballooning budget and, pun somewhat intended, blood in the water. Hollywood and the Hollywood press loves the scent of a disaster. And here you have this young, not quite proven filmmaker in Steven Spielberg, full of this kind of hubris. I'm going to make this amazing film set in the ocean like no one's ever done. And it's just going over budget and full of complication, and stories are coming out about how bad this production is going. Now, the press loves this because it's a story about greatness overshooting itself. It's a story about, bringing Hollywood back down to reality and so on. And sometimes the effect of a film's pre-release press can destroy the film. It happens as far back as Cleopatra. It happens with Elaine May's Ishtar, which is a really good film, but was destroyed by bad press reporting on its budget overruns and delays. Sometimes a film can overcome that, like Titanic, which was also plagued with production problems, shooting in the water, the special effects, and so on, but we know how that turned out. Jaws is similar to Titanic in that it became Jaws, but the delays and the overruns created some panic in the studio, and what they realized was, we have to overcome this. we have to get people to see this film. How are we going to do that? So it was released in June of 75. In October, November of 74, soon after production wrapped, Universal started their PR campaign. An 8-month marketing window was huge. Then today it seems like, you know, the norm, because Jaws created this new model. And they had the filmmakers, they had the cast, they had very positive looking location shots throughout the winter and into the spring. At the same time, they're selling the novel, and at the same time, they're selling merchandise. More than Love Story, definitely more than The Godfather, Jaws figured out we can sell Jaws stuff. And some of you are probably younger viewers of this, but I remember as a kid, I was a kid then, Jaws stuff was everywhere. That image of the shark coming up to the swimmer on the surface is a brilliant piece of marketing. It's a primal fear. It's beautiful design. That shark's nose like a missile, all those teeth. Just look at that picture. It's a thrilling design, and that swimmer, a human, just bait for the death and destruction that this great white beast is about to tear into her with. And they were everywhere. I mean, Jaws t-shirts were everywhere in the middle of the 70s. Jaws beach towels, like who wants a Jaws beach towel? Everybody. Jaws lunch boxes and so on. So they're selling the product before the film has even arrived, and they're pushing the hell out of this movie. They are generating buzz, so that when Jaws was released near the end of June in 1975, there was a feeling that, I don't know what it is, but I have to go see this movie. And then they released it in over 400 cinemas in the United States, which was unheard of. That was saturation booking to the nth degree. Now we release films in thousands of cinemas, but at the time, 450 cinemas, you don't do that, right? How are you going to sustain interest in the film over the next 6 months? Well, maybe we're not, but everyone in America is going to see it the first weekend. And they did. And they came back, because Jaws is a great film. And Jaws is an interesting film to be the first blockbuster, because in a lot of ways, Jaws is very much a new Hollywood film. It's about political corruption and cynicism. It's a macho film with these three sort of brave men, but it also does a fine job, I think, especially with Brody, of depicting his sort of fears. You know, he's afraid of the water. He loves his family. He wants to protect his boys. His precarious position. Yeah, he's the sheriff, but the mayor has more power. The commercial interests have more power. There's a lot going on in Jaws, I don't have to tell you, that makes it more than just what we've come to think of as a blockbuster today, which is part of the reason why people kept going to see it. Yeah, they wanted to see that shark tear into things, but it's a fantastic story as well. And when Jaws landed, and when Jaws made all the money it made, it destroyed Love Story. It destroyed Gone with the Wind. It destroyed The Godfather. It was just a great white shark eating all the other top box office films in its ascent to sort of primacy. The studio heads looked at this, producers looked at this and said, oh my God. Oh my God, the money. 2 years later, Star Wars would come along and topple Jaws from the perch of the greatest earner, and then E.T. would come along, and so on, and we would have this race now, which still exists, with kind of Endgame and Avatar moving back and forth on the top of what's the biggest box office earner of all time. And somehow along the way, this began to be seen as a kind of indicator of quality. There are film fans and cine-east who are like, I don't care how much money a movie makes. That says nothing about how good it is. You're right, it doesn't. It does say something about how appealing it is. It does say something about how ready audiences are to plunk down their money more than once to see that film. but it doesn't say how good it is. But the idea that you could make that much money from the film alone, hundreds of millions in the case of Jaws and Star Wars, and then make tons more money from Burger King and book deals and t-shirt deals, and in George Lucas's case, the brilliance of the toys, right? Then all of a sudden the idea of what a movie could or should be started to change, because if you're going to sell a beach towel, a lunchbox, an action figure, you need to have the kind of film that's going to compel people to want to buy those things. Well, think again about that Jaws image of the shark going up to the swimmer. What's so powerful about that, and what is so not revolutionary but kind of almost groundbreaking about that, is how it distills the entirety of the film and the film's thrills into that one image. Now, of course, there's a lot more going on with the politics and the relationships and so on, but it gets to the point of Jaws. This is a film about a shark that's going to eat you. That's all you need to know. And then you go in and you discover the other joys of the film, and it's great. And this idea about distilling a film down into its basic, essential element developed into the notion of what we call the high concept film. Now, this term used to confuse me before I got really into film studies, because I'd hear high concept and I would think, doesn't that mean something like really weird and complicated and confusing? It's a high concept. It's like conceptual, man. No, it's the opposite. It means the concept is so precise and so able to be defined clearly that you can sell the film with the concept. A great white shark ravages a coastal town during the 4th of July weekend. Concept. And this became increasingly a philosophy behind the making of films and the marketing of films. George Lucas once said something along the lines of, I like a movie whose definition I can hold in the palm of my hand. Desert farm boy teams up with an aged wizard to rescue a princess and save the galaxy from the evil Darth Vader. Concept. Right? And this is still a part of marketing today. Sometimes the film, a blockbuster itself, becomes a concept. So you get Die Hard, right? New York City cop saves a Los Angeles skyscraper from international terrorists. The thing about Die Hard is that there's almost no setup, right? He gets to that skyscraper, the terrorists arrive, and then you get 2 hours of peril and tension and action. Boom, Die Hard. It became a concept. So you could say, like, Speed. We've got this movie, Speed. Oh yeah, what's it about? It's like Die Hard on a bus. We get this movie, Crimson Tide. Really, what's it about? It's like Die Hard on a sub. And so you're distilling it even more. What does that mean? It's like Die Hard on a sub or Die Hard on a bus. There's a wisecracking tough guy, and the peril starts early and just ratchets up throughout the film. Concept. High concept. And this is an important part of the blockbuster strategy, because that's how you can sell the film to different demographics. And what you want for a PG-13 or even an R-rated movie is you want young people, you want married couples, you want young families, if possible, for like Marvel movies or whatever, Harry Potter movies. And you want as many different demographics coming to watch that film as possible so that it can become a blockbuster. So why would a studio want a film like this that they can market to so many demographics and that they hope appeals to so many people? The movie industry and movie audiences are notoriously fickle. So it feels like right now we are trapped in this era of the superhero, and every superhero movie is going to make $500 million or more. It felt like that in the 50s with Westerns. You know, fads come and go. Maybe the superhero movies will be with us for 10 more years, 20 more years, maybe 3 more years. Who knows? Probably more than 3. But there are other blockbusters too. Thoughtful blockbusters. Christopher Nolan films, for example. There are sci-fi blockbusters and so on. And movie studios have a hard time predicting which one of those films is going to do well. And there's an old kind of maxim in Hollywood since the rise of the blockbuster is that if a studio makes 10 films in a year, 10 big budget films in a year, they're going to expect 6 or 7 of those films to bomb. They're going to expect 2 or 3 of those films, check my math, to break even. And they're going to hope that one of those films makes so much money that it covers all the others. So they need to find that main line into an audience's brain that says, I must watch this film. That's the blockbuster model. And there are great blockbusters. Jurassic Park is a great film. E.T. is a great film. I love some of the Marvel films and so on. They're great blockbusters. But it's become a little bit problematic for Hollywood now because this race to catch the next huge box office film has, at least according to some observers, crowded the mid-budget film out of Hollywood. Aside from movies marketed to kids, the movies that the 70s was so good at, like Nashville, like Shampoo, like Harold and Maude, like The Conversation. There's not a huge desire on the part of studios to make these films anymore. Now, some studios are coming in and taking the place, A24, for example. And there will always be these sort of quasi-indie studios or production companies around that try to carve out a little bit of space for the mid-budget film, the thoughtful film, the films that increasingly have an indie feel, even if they're made by studios. But there's a worry now that those films, there's no room for them in the cinema. Maybe they're going to get increasingly shunted over direct to streaming and so on. And that would be a tragedy, because one thing we know about the 70s is that it produced some of the greatest films in American movie history, and people loved them. People went to see them. They stood up around the corner to see The Exorcist. They went to see The French Connection. They went to see Nashville and Robert Altman's movies. There's room for those films, and the blockbuster model hasn't killed them, but it's made it more difficult. And what it did in New Hollywood with Jaws and Star Wars and Close Encounters was make it difficult for studios to want to deal with this small fry. The small fry that had saved them 5, 6, 7 years earlier now seemed less important than the golden calf of $100 million, $200 million. Part of the reason that happened was because by the mid to late 70s, the studios started to realign. And those early creative producers started to get pushed out in favor of producers, mostly men, who understood budgets, who understood money, and who favored high concept blockbusters. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next video in this series, studio realignment at the end of the 70s. That's all for now. Thanks everybody for watching. If you liked the video, let me know. Hit the like button. If you've been watching this series and enjoying it, I'm getting a few comments slowly trickling in. Drop a comment. Let me know. What do you think about blockbusters? What do you think about the existence of mid-budget films? Do you think blockbusters killed Hollywood or made Hollywood something new and great? Let me know. But if you've been watching this series and learning from it, hit the subscribe button. It lets me know that a series like this is interesting to people out there and that I should keep making more of these videos. Thanks for watching though. My name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.